Hello, world. My name is Clinton, and this is the prelude to Silicon and Charybdis. This has been a project of mine to develop the story of our modern-day electrically connected world. And I'm going to start over 200 years ago with the invention of the telegraph. In revolutionary France in the late 1700s, there was a man named Claude Chappé who had an idea for a mechanical system of towers which could transmit messages a long distance almost instantaneously. Atop each tower there would be a bunch of mechanical arms that would shift around depending on what levers and pulleys did, and they would spell out different letters, which then someone else would see and would transmit the message down the line. And he got funding from, he tried several times to get funding from the French government, but they weren't very reliable in the late 1700s. However, eventually his project was taken up and used to great effect by the new emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Claude Chappé wanted his invention to be used for sending messages and relaying stock prices, that sort of thing, but it ended up being a weapon of war and conquest. Other countries obviously noted, and Britain developed their own similar telegraph system. But the new discovery of electricity was going to be the next game changer in sending electronic messages. This was the Europe that a young woman named Florence Nightingale was born into. She was born in Florence, Italy, to a nouveau riche family who were in high society in London, in Britain. And society back then, society meant all the rich people who could go to balls and parties and wear fancy dresses and didn't work a day in their lives. That's what society was. Everyone else was the majority of the population were looked down upon, I suppose you could say, by the elites, the aristocrats, what have you. And Florence Nightingale grew up caring a lot about the plight of people, their well-being, their sickness. It really consumed her as a young child. She was utterly possessed by the notion of making conditions better for people who were suffering and for people who were sick. She developed a strong interest in health and nursing, and she wanted to be a nurse. At the time, nurses were not trained at all. They were basically just poor young women in a lower class job who would take care of people who were dying. And they were often prostitutes. They were often drunk all day, dealing with sickness and misery. And her whole family was horrified by the idea that their daughter would want to get involved in that, as opposed to being a good, polite young woman of society, studying whatever, knitting and reading books and going to balls and finding a suitable husband and whatnot. But Florence was in a world of her own, really. She liked to study statistics and math and other topics. She was utterly obsessed with data analysis. She learned multiple types of statistics, like Bayesian statistics, and she would count all the things in her house and do calculations on them. She would count the flowers in the garden and try to determine things based on the time of day and the season, how many would bloom. She analyzed everything, and everyone thought she was kind of kooky for it. She seemed to be the most happy when she was near the bedside of someone who she could give comfort to, who was sick or who was ailing. And her family thought she was really weird for that, but she was very determined to try to make a difference in the world, and every day sought ways to try and do that. When Florence was just 5 years old, there was a 35-year-old man in New England named Samuel Morse, who was a painter. And he would travel around commissioned to paint people's portraits. And one day while he was out, his wife at home had gotten sick. And a letter was dispatched which took 2 weeks to get to him. And he was doing this painting, and a letter showed up saying that his wife was convalescent. And he rushed home as quickly as he could. And by the time he got home, his wife had not only already passed away, but had died and was buried in the ground. And he missed her funeral. He missed everything. He never got to say goodbye to his wife, and it haunted him horribly. His life was over. He went on a sabbatical to Europe, and he traveled about Europe trying to find something to take his mind off of his misery. And he went to the Louvre in France, and he decided that when he got back to America, he would open up a mini Louvre, like a representation, to bring people in America an idea of all the sort of wonderful art that was in Europe. And when he was sailing back to America, he was on the boat, the Sully, and he overheard a conversation that some of the passengers were having at dinner. One of the passengers described the properties of electricity. And what Samuel Morse heard was that a wire, no matter how long it is, if it had an electrical charge, the state of the wire would change. The wire would be electrified all along the length of the wire, regardless of how long the wire is. Instantaneously, a piece of metal really, really long could change its state. And in a flash, on this boat, crossing the ocean, he realized that the potential for such a thing would allow people to send messages in a code across the length of a wire instantaneously. And had this existed when he was out painting, he would have been able to hear word that his wife was sick. And if such a thing existed, he would have been able to get home in time to be at her bedside for her last hours on Earth, and he would have been able to be at her funeral. And it moved him so greatly, it drove him to obsession about how to develop this technology. What he was inventing all on his own was the telegraph system, only electrically. And he wasn't the first one to think of it. Other people had been doing demonstrations, scientists had been tinkering around, making telegraphs, but Samuel Morse had determination and grit and a purpose and a reason for this thing to exist on Earth. He got back to America, and he started trying to find scientists and funders to help him develop the idea. He talked to professors. He was had lots of ups and downs, pitfalls, good advice, bad advice, lots of failures. But in a few years, he managed to get the American Congress to fund an experiment, and he sent the first ever telegraph in the 1840s, between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and the message was, "What hath God wrought?" Which is a very good question. And the reply, the first reply ever, was, "Have you any news?" And that is exactly what the telegraph, the electric telegraph, was used for. Back in Europe, they quickly took up the electric telegraph technology, and the world was being connected faster than ever. Things were changing very quickly. The press, the newspaper industry, was suddenly, rapidly changed overnight in a number of years. Suddenly, news didn't travel by letters and trains. It was instant, and stories were... they had to reorganize entirely how press and newspapers worked. It was a very tumultuous time. But telegraph wires were being laid down across the world at a very rapid pace. And history, as it does, goes on, and a war began in the Crimean Peninsula, the Crimean War, in 1855. And this was the first telegraph war. This war was being recorded by embedded journalists who were embedded on each side of the war front, who were sending stories through telegraph back to the newspapers every day, so that readers in London, for instance, could pick up the newspaper and read every day about how the war was going, how the boys were doing out east, battling the Russians, right? And the news was terrible. It was winter time, and supplies were getting lost, and young men were getting sick, and they were starving. Before they even got to the battlefield, there was problems. There was people were getting scurvy, and the hospitals were terrible. And the audiences back home watching the story unfold every day on their morning newspaper were horrified. And Florence Nightingale had been studying medicine, and she had been studying nursing, and she had been finding doctors and going to hospitals and having everyone send her, all of her friends were sending her as much medical information and new science and new discoveries about sanitation and health. She had been at home for decades amalgamating and putting together an idea, a scientific view of medicine, all on her own as a hobby. And when she was reading about the situation of the war front, she decided to volunteer, and she wrote a letter to the British government, volunteering to lead a team of nurses out east to the war front to help the soldiers. At the same time, a friend of hers in Parliament, I think the cabinet minister for war, also wrote a letter to Florence Nightingale. He thought of her, and he wrote her a letter asking if she would volunteer. And at the same time, they wrote letters to each other, and the letters actually passed each other in the mail. So she was obviously the perfect person for the job. And in like 10 days, she had a team of 38 nurses who she was training herself with her knowledge. Some of them were nuns, some were just nurses. So, they set out for the war front. Now, in Crimea, in late November of 1855, there was a battle. The Battle of Balaclava. There was multiple fronts going on. And this was a siege that the Allies, including Britain, were laying out against the Russians. And this was being coordinated through telegraph back home. See, the communications on the long scale, thanks to the telegraph, could be managed, and the war could be followed day by day by people back across the continent. However, the situation on the ground, the soldiers, they're right there, like the masses of thousands of people, all the boats, all the officers in their tents, they didn't have radios, they didn't have short-term communications except for messengers and drums. Like, how do you organize tens of thousands of people, right, on the ground, right? It was sort of chaos. And an order came through to commandeer a bunch of cannons from some Russians, a group of Russians who were in retreat, dragging their cannons away on the battlefield, right? A little group of Russians. They're all sick and tired and had been fighting, and the plan was, all right, let's charge this bunch of Russians, chase them off, steal their cannons, disarm the enemy. And so a light brigade, which is a bunch of horseback mounted guys with very light armor, was ordered to go attack these Russians. And this was all well and good. They would have been able to do the job, except at the lowest level of communication, right there on the battlefield, as the orders are being given to the light brigade, the officer giving the orders messed it up. And he pointed the wrong way, and he ordered the light brigade to go charge the wrong group of Russians. The Russians with the cannons, who were all weak and ready to be killed off, they were over there. And he sent this light brigade of horses the wrong way to the wrong camp of Russians. And it was a big camp, a massive camp of Russians who were at the bottom of a hill. And the the Light Brigade of British soldiers were charging them. And you could see them coming from like miles away. This little bunch of guys on horses approaching, and the Russians are sitting there, and they're like, "Are we being attacked? Are they attacking us? Is that all they're sending? Is really?" And and the Light Brigade was charging this massive encampment of all these Russians who were waking up in the morning, well rested, full of weapons, going, "Are we really attacking these guys? Is this who we're charging?" And for like 20 minutes of just like gradual, slow approach of this tiny bunch of Britain charging directly to well, it was suicide. It was suicide. It was an absolute slaughter. And it's one of the most famous battles in history, the Charge of the Light Brigade. How these valiant soldiers followed their orders to the bitter end, charging a massive encampment of Russians and got absolutely slaughtered during the Battle of Balaclava. That story was, when that got told back in the newspapers, it was a huge disgrace. And 10 days later, Florence Nightingale and her team of nurses finally arrived and got to the hospital just in time to see the few surviving soldiers from the Battle of Balaclava and the Charge of the Light Brigade pulling in to the hospital. The wounded, the maimed were put on a boat in the middle of freezing wintertime November and shipped across the Black Sea, and when they died along the way, their bodies were thrown over, and they had nothing but lime juice and salty meat to eat, and stale bread, and their teeth were rotting out, and they couldn't even bite through the thick, hard bread. And what Florence Nightingale and her nurses showed up to was hell on earth, and were it not described in detail, it would be indescribable, horrible conditions. The field hospitals were just places for people to lay and die in their own filth. No blankets. The sewers didn't work. Things were backed up everywhere. There was people bleeding out, getting sick, and all of the regulations and stipulations for the paperwork was so dense that nothing. All of the supplies, the medical supplies, the food that were being delivered, if the paperwork was wrong, it would get like dumped in the sea or sold to someone, right? There was vegetables and fish being dumped in the sea. One time, the soldiers who were freezing with nothing were all administered blankets. And then the doctor running the hospital noticed the paperwork on the blankets was wrong, and he walked around and stole all the blankets back again from all of the soldiers who were laying there sick. And when Florence Nightingale and her team showed up, she raised hell. She barely slept. She, on her own initiative, with money raised by donations from readers of the newspaper, went into Constantinople and bought supplies on her own, bought food on her own, bought blankets and medical supplies. She sent letters and telegraphs. She would spend hours a day, every day, composing letters back home asking. She solicited a chef to come and design them a kitchen that could create and cook healthy food, as opposed to the horrible filth the soldiers were being fed, if they were being fed anything at all. The rats were eating better than the soldiers were. She solicited blankets. She used her entire social network of people back home. She was pleading for help, and in 6 months, according to the data and all the numbers, which she was laboriously tracking and calculating and tabulating as the one-woman computer she was, she reduced the death rate of patients coming into the hospital in Scutari. She reduced the death rate from 42% down to 2% in 6 months. 42% to 2%. And it's because she didn't sleep. She just wrote letters and spammed everyone she knew and sent telegraphs across the world and demanded the world help her help the soldiers who were fighting in the war. And all of the doctors like the military doctors who were there already, were put to shame by her and was sabotaging her work and spreading salacious rumors and calling her all sorts of. They were being disgraced by her. But back home, every day, Britain would wait for the next newspaper to show up so that they could see the continuing story of their girl Florence Nightingale on the battlefront, following her escapades and her work, watching her progress every single day. And this is because she was, this makes her the first electric celebrity. When you can follow someone instantly, on a short time scale across the world and follow their story day by day by day. It's like you're next to them, right? The news is so fresh. It's happening right now. Like, think about it. Before the telegraph, you get a letter that was been sitting in the mail for 3 weeks. You get news of what happened 3 weeks ago. It's old news already. But in the high-speed, interconnected, networked world of the telegraph, all of the readers of the Times of London were they felt a direct connection to the story of the war. Kind of like how I suppose the Vietnam War was the first television war in the 1960s. The Crimean War was the first, in a manner of speaking, televised war in the 1850s. And Florence Nightingale was the lead story. And after fighting and tooth and nail and for supplies and for support and for building a new system of hospitals and training nurses on her own volition every day, tirelessly slaving away in the worst of winter conditions, slogging her way uphill. Anyway, you can only imagine. Every night she would walk past the beds, the cots of all the soldiers, like a 2, 3, 4 hour walk along, holding a lamp at nighttime, never speaking to anyone, too terrified to speak. The horrors of seeing all these suffering people. Like, she just had to suck it up and be stoic and just make her rounds every night, checking on everyone, look him in the eye, give him a nod, walking along the beds, looking at every injured soldier laying there. And, the veterans of the war, remember, tell stories, came home, the ones who survived, tell stories of the lady with the lamp, who every night they would look her in the eye for just a second as she walked past their bed and she was like their guardian angel, and truly she was. Anyway, when obviously she was an absolute amazing sensation. She was a celebrity back home, and when things wrapped up in the war and she was on her way back, there were parades being planned. There were boats being named after her, streets being named after her. There was merchandise, Florence Nightingale fan merchandise. People were buying dolls of her, trinkets. There was a whole industry built around the Florence Nightingale celebrity phenomenon. She wasn't even home yet, and she had to sneak back home. She was undercover. No one knew. She wasn't telling anybody which way she was taking. She dodged all the welcoming committees to get back home because she was traumatized. And she was still driven by this passion. Having seen the state of the military hospitals, she was absolutely driven to improve the situation. And she continued her letter writing and her work and her campaigning, and she demanded investigations. She used her weight, her celebridom, like celebs do. They build up their fan base, and then they start railing against politicians and power structures and start making demands and using their leverage. And she demanded investigations into the state of the military's medical hospitals, and she demanded changes in infrastructure, and she demanded increased sanitation in India, which was a British colony at the time. And but she was a total recluse, a shut-in. She was sick to her stomach. She could barely keep food down. She was probably sick with something. I mean, she had been in the worst sort of conditions on the war front. But every day she would spend hours a day. She was a keyboard warrior for justice, right? The same way you can imagine people today grinding away, sending letters on the internet, trying to get shit done. She was the first person with a fan base, with a collective, and she used with the utmost responsibility and care and the best science and data and narrow focus on achievable goals. She changed the face of medicine. She created the modern institution of nursing. Thanks to Florence Nightingale, nurses have to know medicine. They have to know something, just like the doctors do. Thanks to Florence Nightingale, hospitals stopped being a place you sent people to die, and hospitals became a place you sent people so that they can get better. And she did it all. using media, electric media, and letter sending. And the Europe she came back to was undergoing massive, rapid changes in many different ways. This technology had changed the press. It had changed how politics were done. For instance, foreign ambassadors who were away in foreign countries could now be told how to do their job from the government back home, whereas before, when there was letters, they had some autonomy, or right, they were on their own, they could handle things instead of getting bossed around by the government. There was largely chaos, and it was very tumultuous as industries adapted to the ability. The speed up, it was an electrical speed up, right? Businesses could now lease private telegraph lines, and you could have a business with a home office and a whole bunch of satellite remote offices who are being coordinated from the home office. This is the rise of big industry, of big business. Stock prices or commodity prices or just business deals in general could be conducted in a day, whereas before it would take weeks of letters going back and forth. And this was hell for anybody in business, because now their lives were being consumed by the telegraph. They couldn't sit down to have dinner with their families without a knock on the door, and they have to hurry up and make a business decision before it falls through, because now the prices of things and the competition, right, were changing by the hour. He's like, oh, why didn't you make it to Susie's piano recital? Sorry, I was busy at the office. Right, life had sped up for everyone, for absolutely everyone. Crime fighting was changed. Now, someone making a fast getaway from the scene of the crime on a train could be captured by police who are waiting for them already at the next train station, having gotten word by telegraph that there was a criminal coming, right? Betting was all changed. There used to be, if you wanted to say you were betting on a horse race that was happening, miles and miles away, and the bookies the betting would be open until news of the results came in. But people were finding ways to secretly telegraph the results of the race ahead of time and bet on the winner before the official results came in, right? Everything had to change because of the creation of this instantaneous, simultaneous electric technology. And this was all built on the infrastructure of the telegraph operator. So the telegraph operator is the person, and it was men, women, children. It was very meritocratic. Anyone could get a job as a telegraph operator. All you had to do was show that you knew Morse code and show up at a telegraph office and show off. If you could sit there and go doot 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 faster than average, you had a job. It was very right. Anyone could do it. They were hiring lots of strange characters who made up the first online community, because when the lines were slow, people were chatting. It was a whole bunch of people sitting alone in a room. Like, they're not alone with a book, they're alone with a little clicking box which is talking to them, and they're in a little online community, social network, talking to their friends across the world, right? There was friendships, there was marriages, there was all sorts of dramas going on. It was like the world's first chat room of people, and when it was busy, they were transmitting the messages of business, of politics, of the news, right? Like, the world was building up on this infrastructure, and it was very inefficient at first. There was lots of backlogs. At the same time every day, a whole bunch of messages come in at once, and the one person has to sit there. And so there's all sorts of subtle incremental improvements being done, which developed the first science of information transfer, and lots of the theory behind how the internet works today. Packet switching, for instance, is inspired by all the systems which you had to make to handle these loads of traffic, so that telegraphs could, there's fast ones, slow ones, you have multiple lines, or you try to find ways to send messages, multiple simultaneous messages all at the same time down the same wire. In London, there was a massive telegraph office with like 300 people all connected by pneumatic tubes. Okay, here's a message incoming for here, and then it had to be received and heard and written down and then sent to the right person, who then sends it out again from the central office to the dispatch office, right? The creation of this network of centralized processing centers, like data centers, and then end nodes, and then getting the messages delivered. It was very much like the internet today, and this grew up in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. And in this time, you had these telegraph operators talking to no one through a machine, interfacing with a little clicking, click, 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 and talking in their own little language. And it was extremely human. People could recognize each other based on their finger, right, their touch, right? Like, people had a cadence and a pressure. You could tell when your friend was the one sending the message. People developed an ear for it, and the telegraph operator network was a very tight-knit community. In 1874, a Frenchman, Émile Badeau, created the successor to Morse code. He created a 5-bit code that could send letters one at a time. And it was a binary code, which eventually replaced the telegraph operator and the Morse code. And all the telegraph operators would spend a couple decades of their life doing nothing more in their career than sending the messages of the world, were suddenly unemployed and replaced by machines. It must have been very hard for them. But the new telegraph operators instead were working more sophisticated equipment that could send things faster. And Émile Badeau, his code evolved generally over decades into what became known as the Ascii Code, which is the binary letter representation used in computing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Character encoding in computers developed directly from Émile Badeau's code. And the speed of a modem, the number of symbols sent per second, is measured in bauds. We talk about kilobauds or megabauds in memory of Émile Badeau. But yeah, the science of telegraphy was constantly evolving. And in 1874, back in America, a man called Alexander Graham Bell was trying to develop a way to send multiple telegraph messages down the same line using different harmonic frequencies. So we had a whole bunch of reeds, like a low one and a high one and a higher one, bow, bow, bow. And if you could send multiple frequencies across the line, you could send multiple signals, right? And one time while he was working on it, his lab partner on the other side of his telegraph twanged one of the reeds very hard, and Alexander Graham Bell heard it. Boing! He heard the noise, and it was a real noise, as though he had been standing on the other side of the system, and he thought, wait a minute, that was a sound. You can transmit sounds through these wires, not just binary signals. And he realized what was going on, and now, of course, Alexander Graham Bell developed the first telephone, and he had always been thinking of it as a continuation of the telegraph system, but no, the telephone ended up being something wildly, completely different, and that took off. It was huge. Obviously, the telephone changed the world, but there's no record of the telephone. There's no guaranteed, written down hard copy of exactly what the message is. So, coming into the 20th century, both the telegraph and the telephone, in addition to, of course, snail mail and whatnot, comprised the infrastructure of communication, and this was the accelerated, fast-paced world. That there had been lines laid down across the oceans connecting North America to Europe, and the radio was coming in too, as well, with Marconi. But this is the origin of the human experience of living in a high-paced, information-abundant, simultaneously connected world, where it feels like our very nervous systems, who we are ourselves, is projected across the planet because of, today we use the internet, But this has been around for over 100 years. This electrical environment, and that's how it started. I think it's mind-blowing, and I think it's very important that we understand the responsibilities of what it means to be so connected to in this electric cyberspace, to be so connected to everything else. The potential reach for any one person is now global, and I'm greatly inspired by Florence Nightingale, who spent her whole life obsessing over the proper scientific way to ease human suffering, to help make people better, to improve medicine. And she did the homework, and she basically cut out all of the human relations in her life. She, in her letters, she wrote that she would forsake human personal contact and be lonely for the rest of her life so as to dedicate all of her time to the world. And that's it's a mind-boggling. It's like the level of dedication and obsession that she showed is reflected in the reserve and the careful responsibility, the very careful response. If you're going to go around telling the government what to do, she's sending letters to the Queen, demanding the Queen do something about sanitation in India. She's busting heads, barking orders, and people listened. Her friend, the MP in Parliament, who was basically her one connection to the British Parliament system, who was the guy in the House of Commons ramming through all the stuff that she was telling them to do. He got sick, and his doctor said he had to retire. And she said, no, you don't. You're too important. This is too important. You can't leave me. You can't quit. And she made him stay in his job. Like she strong-armed him, and he relented, and he didn't take his doctor's advice, and he died. She pressured a guy into dying because her work was so important. That's a social justice warrior right there. And it's amazing to look at events today, the world today. People who spend all their time typing away on a keyboard, ramming events around. You have to understand, and you have to take very seriously what it is, the personal responsibility you have. You better be someone worth listening to, I feel, if you're going to do that. And that is the prelude to Silicon and Charybdis. When I pick it up again, we'll be talking about the origins of the microcomputer in 1975. I'll leave you now with a recording Florence Nightingale made late in her age, just as audio recording had been invented, and in memory of her comrades in Balaclava. Until next time, I'm Clinton. Take care.
I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work